London, 1305. The streets were alive with noise, vendors shouting, horses clattering. But on one particular morning, a different sound took over. The roar of a crowd hungry not for justice, but for blood. Thousands gathered, not for celebration, but for one of the most infamous executions ever recorded. They came to watch a man die, but not just any man. This was William Wallace, the rebel knight who dared to defy the English crown and ignite Scotland's fight for independence. What they witnessed wasn't an execution. It was psychological warfare disguised as justice. Wallace wasn't given a soldier's death. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The most brutal punishment imaginable, reserved only for traitors. But Wallace wasn't a traitor to Scotland. He was its hope. The English knew that, which is why his death had to be more than final. It had to be unforgettable. And it was. But to understand how Wallace ended up on that execution scaffold, we have to go back to the chaos of 13th century Scotland. The land was torn between loyalty and survival. England saw Scotland not as a sovereign nation, but as a province in rebellion. When Wallace led his men to victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, it shook the myth of English invincibility. He wasn't a noble, he wasn't rich, but he became a symbol. And symbols are dangerous. King Edward I, also known as Longshanks, knew rebellion was like fire. It spread. And to stop it, you don't just kill the leader, you make him suffer. For years, Wallace evaded capture. But eventually, betrayal came from within. In 1305, he was caught near Glasgow, likely through the treachery of another Scottish knight. And that's when his real suffering began. The journey to London was a parade of shame. Wallace was tied, mocked, and dragged from town to town like a trophy. The goal? Break him before the rope ever touched his neck. But Wallace never begged. He never cried. And that terrified his captors even more. His trial was a joke, held in Westminster Hall and conducted in Latin, a language Wallace didn't even speak. He was charged with treason against a king he never acknowledged. His response was legendary. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. That one sentence was pure fire. It was truth spoken in the face of tyranny, and it sealed his fate. Wallace was sentenced to the full horror of medieval execution, not just to die, but to be destroyed piece by piece. The message was clear. Challenge England, and you'll be unmade. But the question remains, did this spectacle of cruelty really kill the cause? Or did it light the fuse for something even greater? In the next part, we reveal what happened on the day of Wallace's death, the grotesque ritual England called justice. Stay tuned. August 23rd, 1305. The sun rose over London, but for one man, it rose only to witness his destruction. William Wallace, bound and broken, was dragged through the streets tied to a wooden hurdle behind horses, not carried, not marched, but scraped against the filth-covered stones. It was deliberate humiliation, a message carved into every cobblestone he passed. The crowd didn't come in silence. They came roaring, laughing, throwing food scraps and insults. But Wallace, chained, bloodied, exhausted, kept his head high. He refused to plead. He refused to weep. In that moment, his silence was louder than any king's command. He was no longer just a man. He had become something else, an idea too dangerous to ignore. Arriving at Smithfield, the executioners wasted no time. He was hanged, but not to die. They let him choke until death nearly took him, then cut the rope. His body convulsed for air, struggling, but it wasn't mercy. It was preparation. What came next was not punishment. It was theater of horror. He was stripped, his abdomen opened, his intestines pulled out in front of a crowd drunk on cruelty. And yet, he remained conscious. They burned his entrails in front of his eyes. He still didn't scream. Some said he looked skyward. Others said he mouthed a prayer. His executioners wanted a broken traitor. What they got was a martyr in the making. After the mutilation, they beheaded him. But that wasn't enough. They quartered his body, each limb sent to different corners of the kingdom. His head was dipped in tar and placed on London Bridge as a warning. But the warning backfired. What they tried to use to kill fear instead fueled fury. In Stirling, his left arm was nailed to a gate. In Newcastle, his leg was hung from a tower. These weren't signs of deterrence, they were signs of defiance. Every piece of Wallace became a banner, every drop of blood a seed of resistance. The crowd that once mocked him began to whisper his name with reverence. He had no crown, no title, no royal blood, yet he was now larger than any king. His death, meant to erase him, turned him into an immortal symbol. The man was gone, but his courage became legend. He had dared to say no to a tyrant. He had dared to believe that ordinary people could rise against empires. And though his body was destroyed, his voice, his stand, would echo through generations. What the English crown failed to understand was this: you can torture a man, dismember a body, but you cannot destroy a movement born from truth. Wallace's story had just begun to spread, not just through Scotland, but across all lands where the oppressed whispered his name as hope. His death didn't close a chapter. It opened a revolution. The ashes of William Wallace had not yet cooled when the impact of his death began to ripple across Scotland. What King Edward intended as the ultimate act of submission became the spark of a deeper resistance. Wallace's death was meant to terrify, but instead it inspired. News of his torture spread not only by word of mouth, but through whispered stories in taverns, secret gatherings in castles, and the defiant glances of villagers who refused to kneel. In the hills and forests of Scotland, people didn't see a traitor. They saw a hero, a man who chose agony over surrender, a man who faced unspeakable horror and still did not bend. Wallace had shown the Scottish people what it meant to resist, even if it meant dying in pieces. His story gave them a reason to rise, and rise they did. Among those who heard of Wallace's execution and felt its weight was Robert the Bruce. Once uncertain, now awakened, he saw in Wallace not just a martyr, but a path. Within 9 years of Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce would lead Scotland to victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a triumph that would shatter English claims to dominance and reignite the dream of independence. Wallace did not live to see that day, but he helped make it possible. His execution became a political weapon, not for England, but for Scotland. Every brutal detail of his death added fuel to a national myth, being written not by rulers, but by ordinary people. He was remembered not as a failed rebel, but as the soul of a free Scotland. Artists painted his likeness with fire in his eyes. Poets wrote verses that turned his pain into purpose. Soldiers fought under his name. The very act that was meant to erase him had given birth to something immortal. But Wallace's influence didn't stop at the Scottish border. His execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Kings and nobles watched with a mixture of fear and disgust. England's message had been clear: rebel, and you'll be destroyed. But the brutality was so extreme that it exposed something else: the cruelty of empire, the violence used to protect power, the fragility of a rule that needed torture to sustain itself. In time, legal scholars and thinkers would look back at Wallace's trial and see not justice, but tyranny. He was condemned without a real trial, executed with a method that violated every principle of human dignity, and used as propaganda to silence dissent. Yet all of this failed. The very system that tried to turn him into an example instead made him eternal. Generations later, his story would be remembered during movements for liberty and self-rule far beyond Scotland, in Ireland, in America, in places where the fight against imperial power echoed the cries from medieval London. Wallace had become more than Scottish. He had become universal. His death had shown the world that there are fates worse than dying, and one of them is living without freedom. And for those who live under oppression, his story became proof that standing for justice may cost everything, but it gives something far more powerful in return: legacy. A legacy that grows louder each time someone stands up, each time someone refuses to kneel. Wallace taught us that even when your voice is silenced, your courage speaks forever. His execution had been meant to shut a mouth, but it opened a movement, and it continues to grow. As Wallace's name became legend, the scars of his execution burned deeper into the conscience of Scotland. His mutilated body was scattered, but his memory grew whole in the hearts of a people who had seen too many betrayals and bowed too many times. For the English crown, his death was the loudest threat they could issue. But for the Scots, it was the clearest call to action. Across villages and highlands, his name was spoken not in fear, but in fire. Families who had never held a sword began teaching their children Wallace's name as if it were scripture. He was no longer just a man. He was a lesson, a warning, a dream. Songs were sung about his courage. Symbols were etched into stone and carved into wood, all in secret, all in defiance. The trauma of his execution transformed into unity. Even those who had once distanced themselves from him, the Scottish nobles who had submitted to the English king, could not escape the shadow his death cast over them. His absence made him present everywhere. The brutality of the execution, meant to erase him, only magnified his presence in daily life. Wallace had become untouchable in the only way that matters, through memory. His legacy became a tool, a rallying point, a psychological force that English authority could not counter. While Edward I had hoped to suffocate Scottish resistance by destroying its loudest voice, he had done the opposite. He had amplified it. Robert the Bruce, who would once have been considered a rival or alternative to Wallace, now stood upon the foundation Wallace had built with his own blood. His campaigns, his confidence, and his eventual kingship all bore the fingerprint of Wallace's sacrifice. The tactics of war also began to change. Knowing that surrender could lead to a death like Wallace's, Scottish warriors adopted a fiercer, more desperate form of resistance. To be captured was not just to die, but to be degraded. So they fought harder. They fought with nothing to lose. Wallace's death created a generation that would rather perish in the mud with a sword in hand than be dragged through streets as an example. In many ways, the horror of Wallace's end gave Scotland its edge. The English crown noticed this shift. No longer was rebellion a regional spark, it was a wildfire. English forces became more brutal, more desperate to reassert control, but the harder they pushed, the more unified Scottish resistance became. The myth of Wallace began influencing even those beyond the battlefield. Writers, clergy, and philosophers began to question what justice truly meant. Was Wallace a criminal, or was he proof that law could be used as a tool for oppression? These questions lingered for centuries. The documentation of Wallace's trial and execution, kept in the English archives, became proof not just of punishment, but of the cold calculation behind political cruelty. It showed a system that feared ideas more than armies, and was willing to torture one man to protect its illusion of control. That illusion had cracked. Even in England, whispers grew. The crown had turned a rebel into a saint. It had written its own opposition into legend. The spectacle they had created to terrify had begun to backfire. Wallace's death became a mirror. It showed the people of Britain, and of Europe, what empire really looked like when stripped of its pageantry. The moral cost, the spiritual decay. The blood-soaked stones of London no longer whispered of victory. They screamed of injustice. And from that scream, something new began to rise. A collective memory. A truth that couldn't be burned, buried, or quartered. A truth that power built on cruelty eventually collapses beneath the weight of its own crimes. William Wallace's execution was supposed to be a conclusion, but it became a beginning no one could control. Centuries have passed since William Wallace was dragged through London streets and torn apart before a cheering crowd, but the echo of that day still reverberates through history. His execution was intended to erase a rebellion, yet it became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance the world has ever known. England thought it was silencing a traitor. What it did was forge a martyr. And as the years moved on, Wallace's death transformed from a national tragedy into a global lesson about the limits of tyranny, the power of sacrifice, and the enduring flame of freedom. The physical brutality of his punishment, his body quartered, his organs burned, his head tarred and spiked, was meant to crush morale. Instead, it revealed how fragile empires truly are when they rely on fear to rule. Wallace didn't die quietly. He died defiantly, and that defiance rewrote the narrative. His voice, silenced by steel, now lives in books, monuments, music, and films. But beyond the legends and artistic portrayals lies the deeper truth. He was a man who gave everything for a country that hadn't yet fully formed. He fought not for titles or power, but for the idea that people should govern themselves. That idea didn't die with him. It spread. It took root in Scotland, where independence movements still evoke his name. It crossed oceans, where revolutionaries in America, France, Ireland, and beyond drew strength from his stand. Even as modern laws and constitutions replaced swords and crowns, the image of Wallace facing his fate without flinching remained a symbol that justice is worth the highest price. His execution also contributed, indirectly, to the evolution of human rights. Historians, legal thinkers, and philosophers cited the horror of his punishment as a prime example of state cruelty gone unchecked. The very excess of it, meant to inspire obedience, became a reason for future societies to set limits on what governments can do to the human body and spirit. In death, Wallace influenced not just nations, but the conscience of civilization itself. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of Wallace's story is how familiar it still feels. In a world where oppression continues in new forms, where truth is often punished and resistance branded as treason, Wallace's fate serves as a reminder of both danger and duty. Power still fears voices like his, and still tries to silence them. But history remembers courage. History remembers those who do not bend. William Wallace may have died without a crown or army, but his memory wears the armor of legacy. His scream still cuts through the silence. His fire still burns. And for every person who has stood up against tyranny, for every voice that refuses to be silenced, there is a piece of Wallace living on. Not just in statues or screenplays, but in action, in every choice to speak, to stand, to resist. His body was scattered, but his spirit was never touched. That is the power no executioner can destroy. That is why his story will never end,